In this class I'll be using After Effects 2080, but you can use any After Effects version where you can find Shape Layer tool, or even earlier version and use Solid instead of shape layers. So I'll create a small composition with maybe 590 frames, 30 FPS, so 3 seconds long. I'll create shape layer, hit U double time, set to small, maybe 50-50, and set some keyframing. Aligning, holding shift and arrow key, then pause this for a few frames, and then going up, holding shift arrow key, off the opacity. And now I have this animation. I'd like to add opacity animation, so it's kind of fade in. And to work with the speed, I hold right key, keyframe assistant, and easy ease using stuff. Same thing for the position, right key, right click, keyframe assistant, easy. Then I go into the graph. Be sure I using, let me show you, after select graph type, and now it's a velocity graph, and with holding shift move these tangents to the left. So we have this speed up animation. I want to add some blinking elements, and I'm using small composition, or I can use new solid with maybe 20 in size, going to opacity 0, then holding page down for 2 frames in front, 100, 0, 100, alt right bracket to shrink their size. We have fading, and I want to select them, right click, keyframe assistant, to hold keyframe, not keyframe assistant, hold keyframe. So it's like blink. You'll see 2 frames no, 2 frames visible, 2 frames no. I duplicate this thing, moving to the right, Ctrl D, moving to the right, moving to the down, and moving to the down. It's like semi-square. Select them, Ctrl Shift C, go into pre-comp, Ctrl key for the settings, shrink down, and move this to the center, showing the center. So it's like, try this. When you move not properly, you'll see this semi-transparent line. When you move correctly, it will be very straight. I offset by maybe 2 frames all these layers, and I'll get this type of animation. Or maybe by 4 frames, shrink down the comp, trim. We have kind of block that we can duplicate. So we have our element. I'll set opacity to 100 just to arrange this thing properly. For example, like this. Then going back, 0 as it was, small animation here. I duplicate this pre-comp, or I rename it to element number 1, Ctrl D for duplicate, or I think Command on Mac. I'll reduce this thing so I have bigger step in blink. Duplicate element, replace with holding Alt, scale this thing to 50, move it here, so we have this kind of animation. Move it layer, and this is very simple, and I want to add a few more elements and create new shape layer, or you can use solid, maybe 25. I rearrange this thing so we don't have any cross at the start. Just simple animation with position, opacity, hitting U, then 40 frames, going to left, and then, for example, I move this thing with arrow key, and opacity going down, this thing going down, 10 frames for fading, and keeping 100. So we have 0, 100, 100, 0. Select all of them, right click, or you can click on keyframes, keyframe assistant, easy ease, shrink down the layer, move it to the side, and something like this. Then we're going to position, go into keyframe, graph, move this thing to the left for the speed, and this type of animation. And this is our basic element that we can use. It's very simple and don't have any complex stuff. It's just a squares. For example, we can add one more square animation. Maybe size of 20, and to use this side of our composition. Go into position, then 10 frames to the bottom, stick with 5 frames, going to this, waiting, and few moving to the down, like this. Holding them, you can use shortcut F9 or any or you said before. Go into graph, move it to the left. Now we arrange some opacity, hit this thing, hit U, and then fading 100, 0. So this is small animation piece. In next chapter I'll show you how we can create more complex thing on this base element. After we create base animation, we can complex this thing. I'm going to pre-compose this shape layer with this animation. I name this element 03. Duplicate this composition, rotate to 90 degrees, move to 50% scale. Align it to the bottom. So, this kind of animation. I am going and drop comp to new comp, going to its settings, twice it. So, we'll have 100 per 100. And I going set the square of this comp. So I duplicate, go into transform, flip horizontal, align it, duplicate, move it to the bottom, transform, flip vertical, duplicate to the left, and flip horizontal. So we have this kind of mirroring. It looks very magical or symmetrical, mathematical, I don't know how to name it. I move this thing in another comp. Now I duplicate this thing, go into scale, 50% scale, go into opacity, maybe 25%, duplicate, rotate to 90 degrees, 25%, and maybe 100% visible. And now I'm going to this composition settings and extend it maybe to 120 frames, so we have 4 seconds. And I rearrange. We have small, middle, and big comp. And I want to make a sequence. So I start with small, then go big, and then middle. Rearrange this thing. Going to move middle to the end of this comp, and maybe 50%, 50 frames at the big. So we can play our animation and you'll see we have something interesting. Even we have very simple setup, it looks with this kaleidoscopic effect more complex. Now we can go and duplicate one more comp number 3 and bring this to comp number 4. Duplicate, shrink down to 50. Now you'll have to decide when to stop, because you can duplicate this thing over and over again and create a mess of these elements. I don't want to have a mess in the center, so I go and set this comp maybe to 0 at the side. One more at the other side, so it have to be, I think, 1000. I shrink down the opacity maybe to 20% or even 10%, so it's very subtle and you'll have this magic going on. And in next video we're gonna to set the camera, depth of field and all other effects. We go and drop our comp number 4 to new comp. This is will be square oriented, for example like Instagram, and I up a bit in resolution, or you can go and set 2000, it's up to you. And if you use 4K, you can use 4K settings. It works the same thing, just like these digits. I go and pick up the frame where all elements are clearly visible. Going to layer settings, I use F4 for this. Bring this to 3D, create null object, create camera. In camera I'll set portraitic stuff like 50 or 80 millimeters. Going and translate null 1 to 3D layer, parent the camera and rotate with these digits. So I use 45 and maybe so 45 and rotate to maybe minus 45. And I'd like to have bigger angle. Going to scale it to the back. Going to comp, we have a lot of dark place. I use FX console from Video Copilot, or you can use FX or another window tab with searching plugins. I think stylize motion tile, or you can use FX console, type here motion tile and it brings the same thing. Extend our comp maybe in 3 times, or even I think 5 times. Yes, we have beautiful elements going here. Now I have to be sure that our focal length and focus depth are set properly, so I select camera and our null. Go into camera and set focus to distance layer. Now we have everything is in focus. I'd like to maybe scale down a bit our base element for now, maybe to 80. Go into camera with tapping 2 times to A and up aperture. So we have this depth of field going into place. Something I think in between maybe. Now you have your animation with this technological blur, this animation. It looks, I think, very interesting. But we can do and go further. We have our base element. I would like to duplicate this thing, add some blur, for example fast box blur, or if you're in legacy version, fast blur, just blur our element. So we have this kind of glow. Going to opacity, bring down maybe to 75. Then we go and duplicate our layer again, going to position and move it to few frames, few pixels to the bottom. Going to opacity, shrink down maybe to 20 or maybe 40 and move it down a bit, 10, and fast blur maybe 2 is not enough, and it creates reflection flow effect, so takes more time to calculate. So I going to some frames here. Yeah, you see this glow and all this element. I want to create a grid at the bottom, so I go create new composition, call it background, create shape layer, going to fill and set it to radial gradient. Move this thing to the side. We can drop it to our comp, set it to 3D layer, scale it, shrink down the opacity, and you'll have some center glow. And then you can add some more background. So I duplicate. Instead of using gradient, I'm using fill. We go in and create grid this step. So for example 5, or I can set this width slider with border set to 2. Go into comp, drop our background, set to 3D, upscale this thing, going and lowering the opacity to 10%. This kind of cell is bringing this technology look, and I'll duplicate this grid with set not to 32, but I up this thing to 40 and this to maybe 10, and shrink down the opacity to 20%, kind of small cells. If you have far more time, you can add adjustment layer, bring it to the top, add Video Copilot free color vibrance effect that tint all this thing. We go to fill empty background and set this thing to blue, and now you'll get this animation. I'll calculate this thing for you. Before I do this, I'll see that our camera is too far. We see this end with empty black, so I zoom in, or going and up focal length maybe to 135 millimeters. It's like isometric look. So now I can move it to the top, reselect camera and null, going to camera, set focus distance to our layer. I have to manage the aperture settings to have very strong blue at the side, maybe 400, and you can use iris shape and create, for example, square elements or maybe octagon tweak these settings of bokeh. And you can find, for example, if you don't want to play with squares and you have triangles, you can create the matching iris shape. So I pick up the first rectangle, calculate this thing, and we'll see what we get. Our animation calculated, very high detailed, and you can move this thing and focus, for example, to these white elements because everything is parent to null. And you can do one more thing before we end this class. So let me show you how to navigate. So you can move this thing and not z-axis but y. You can change the focus, but you have to move background layers with null. I want to show you a few more things that we can improve in this animation. So watch next video.
As I said in previous lesson, before we finish this class, I'll show you how to improve this thing. First of all, we have a few frames at the end and the same frames in the start. So I would like to suggest to create some fade-in animation. So 0 and fade out. 10 and this fading. And it brings more life to your scene. It's more logical, so we have some flashing in, then we have our detailed animation, and then we have fade out. So let's calculate this thing. It takes a lot of time because of Blu-ray and this 3D layer stuff, but I think it's worth it. And fast calculation in the end. And now we produced a single shot. But sometimes you need to create not this single shot. Let me rename this thing to single. But you need to create loop. And now I'll show you how you can easily create looping stuff with this composition. Going to loop. Composition number 5, loop. I have to put this comp 4 in new pre-comp. So I name it this no loop. I solo this layer and divide this stuff maybe in end, like here. So I split this layer, I think split layer with this, move this thing to the left and find the place where I have almost nothing in this cut, like few elements only, and then going to start with our animation so they blend a bit and overlay. Maybe I want to end this in 75 frames, so I move this here. I delete this animation of background, shrink down our composition, unsolo, going to move this to 3D, hit play, and you'll see that when the end of our animation goes, we have the start of our animation. Now we lost some effects with motion tile. I'll show you how to fix this thing, because now we have cutting of our elements, so we don't have a lot of going on the side, so we have few frames to calculate, and we'll check how it works and does it work for us. And now we'll see that we have perfect loop. We go to our no loop composition and we'll see that we have motion tile here, but our frames became 2D. We're going and copy camera and null to our no loop composition, and of course extend this thing. Everything is back. We're going to loop, unselect this 3D, and now we have two kind of animation based on one simple composition. Single animation with fade in and fade out of our background. You can even tweak this thing to fade earlier. And loop animation, when elements going, going and going, and we have no stop. Now I can tell you that the class is over. You can produce two types of animation: no loop, single shot, and loop, based on very simple and nothing complex in the start composition. And now going to duplicate, rearrange, and mix the thing to create, I think, very cool looking stuff. And I hope you get some new ideas for your projects. Thank you for watching.